I have already indications that many targets that were recommended by the Secretary of Defense were rejected by CENTCOM, that they were civilian targets. I believe that people are already saying no to the hierarchy. The CENTCOM commander is walking a very thin line where he is trying to do the best he can to implement military objectives as he understands them without getting fired.
Retired Army Major General Randy Manner telling MS Now that military officials have said no to targets in Iran recommended by Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. Hold that thought. General Herdling, anything you can add to this?
Yeah, Mika, this is not a surprise to me. Anybody that's been in a room where a kinetic strike package has been put together, a time-sensitive target or a strike package, understands what goes into it. It isn't just issuing orders to hit something. You do an assessment of the target. You look at the dangers around that target. You look at the potential for collateral damage to civilians. You look at the effects on your operation and the military you're fighting against. It isn't just hit all these things and everything's going to be okay. There are commanders in the room, intelligence officers in the room, and legal advisors in the room when these strike packages are being put together. There's no doubt in my mind, Randy Manners is exactly right, that you're going to get pushback at the Secretary of Defense level if you tell someone to strike something that hasn't been assessed. And that's what the commander, the CENTCOM commander, Admiral Cooper's job is. His job is to say, we're having effects on things we're doing. It isn't just an overall genocidal push, which I believe was coming out of the mouth of the president when he said we were going to level Iran and destroy all the energy plants and the water plants and all those kind of things. You just don't allow that to happen if you're a commander, because you know you could go to jail for it.
And I think, I mean, Richard, I think it's good that we're at the point we're at today and not what was being threatened.
100%.
At the same time, that genocidal push that General Herdling just referred to, these threatening posts do have damage, do have repercussions and consequences.
The good news is the pushback. You know, in a democracy, there's checks and balances. And this is actually a good example of checks and balances of people in government, that their loyalty is to the Constitution and to law and so forth and ethics, and that you push back against orders that they think are questionable. I actually find it really reassuring. We'd be thinking about the different conversation we would be having around this and other tables this morning if things had gone ahead. Can we return to the New York Times story just for a second?
Sure.
As someone who spent a lot of hours and days in Situation Room, so many things about that are stunning. One is how quick the president, we talked about, the president says, sounds good to me. Once presidents speak up in a meeting, the conversation's over, because then people are going to be, in most cases, particularly in this administration, reluctant to challenge them. I remember George H.W. Bush, when we were having debates about how to react to the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, specifically held back. He wouldn't say what he wanted. He wanted to hear what everybody else had to say. This is a president who doesn't. Second of all, think about it. The lack of expertise in the room. There wasn't one person in that room who had direct familiarity with Iran. People weren't saying, well, what about the Iran-Iraq war? What lessons are from that? Or is regime change really a serious possibility, given all these institutions that have developed over the last 47, 48 years in Iran? No one said that. The fact that they were having this meeting after the Israelis came in, basically played the president and said, you can be a great historical figure if you do this, and that we weren't prepared for that.
General Herdling, Richard's just reference to George H.W. Bush strikes me as indicating one element of President Bush, former President Bush, being allowed to step back and just listen. Unlike anybody in the Situation Room, other than perhaps a few military people, President Bush had actually been to war, and that makes a difference in decision making. He had seen war up close and personal.
General?
I'm sorry, I missed your question, Mike, but I want to comment on what Richard just said, because there was one person in the room that should have had a lot of information about Iran, because they get briefed before they go over there, and that's the military advisor to both the president and the Secretary of Defense, and that's General Kane. And reading the report in the New York Times was fascinating to me because Kane did exactly what a chairman of the Joint Chiefs is supposed to do. It's to give advice and recommendations. But it seemed like everybody else in the room, as Richard said, became quiet when asked the question and when the president started speaking. And I've been in those rooms too, and it does put a pale on everyone else. But you're getting the the director of the CIA saying it's farcical, and you're getting the Secretary of State saying it's bullshit. And then you're getting the chairman of the Joint Chiefs saying an assessment of the area and also the logistics capacity of delivering weapon systems that are in short supply. And then you have the president saying, well, it's my gut telling me that we should do that. Boy, there should have been a whole lot more pushback, but you can understand the Maggie Haberman piece is giving it from a view of very limited information, probably leaked by someone in the room, and we can all guess who that is based on who comes out the best in this reporting, and saying, well, it was the president's gut. It does quash all of the conversation. But I got to tell you, from the standpoint of what I read about what the chairman did, he has a lot of information because he has an entire staff in the J5 that can tell him all the cultural dynamics, and in the J3 of the Joint Staff, they can tell him the operational dynamics. And he goes over to that Oval Office meeting, and I'm sure Richard will reinforce this, with a huge book about everything regarding the area. The other thing that strikes me about that article is when the meeting was taking place and when the action occurred afterwards. We're talking weeks, not even months, between when those initial meetings were taking place and when we started shipping carrier strikes groups to the area. That tells me that it reinforces everything we've been saying for the last several weeks, is there wasn't much of a plan, there wasn't much of a strategic objective other than to support Netanyahu, and there wasn't a whole lot of reliance on any allies getting them to support us. All those things will contribute to dysfunction and eventual failure.
Richard, briefly, there's an extraordinary direct quote from inside the Situation Room from General Kane when President Trump is touting the presentation that Prime Minister Netanyahu has made. It said, "It sounds good to me." Here's what General Kane says, quote, "Sir, this is, in my experience, standard operating procedure for the Israelis. They oversell, and their plans are not always well developed. They know they need us, and that's why they're hard selling." That's from General Kane to the president.
Yes, so two reactions to that. One is I wish the general had been more forthcoming, speaking about his own doubts about the war. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they have a responsibility, and he fulfilled that exactly. But I've also been in the room where several chairmen have said, Mr. President, but you're not speaking as chairman, but speaking as myself, here's what I think. And General Kane never pivoted to that. The chairman never, if you will, because it comes out in the article that he and others thought this was a terrible idea. The president never heard that. So what you don't say in these meetings in some ways becomes as significant as everything you do say. Secondly, one of the losers of this war is going to be the U.S.-Israeli relationship. Israel's standing in the United States was already coming under pressure from the left because of Gaza. It really worries me that I would argue that the Prime Minister of Israel overplayed his hand, overpushed. And I think one of the casualties of this is going to be the U.S.-Israeli relationship. You heard it a little bit from the chairman in his comment, this is overselling. The next time Israel comes and pushes something, people are going to say, what about it? Is this in your interest? Is this in our interest? I just worry that the repercussions of this over time, this is potentially a somewhat damaged relationship over the medium and long term.
Yeah, many aftershocks. That'll be one. I suspect it's going to be a busy morning on Truth Social. President Trump has just posted about the situation in Iran and this deal. He says that we're closely with Iran, which, quote, we have determined has already gone through what will be a very productive regime change. So that's an open question there, as there's a belief that even more hardliners are empowered. He does say, and this is something we talked about earlier, he says there will be no enrichment of uranium, and the United States will, working with Iran, dig up and remove what he calls nuclear dust. Now, that's different. That's the Iran proposal suggests there could still be uranium. The U.S. is insisting no. So whether this is something that's been agreed to or just Trump imposing or claiming, that's what we don't know. This is going to be sort of the heart of what we see coming up this week. as negotiations begin in Pakistan. And he also notes that we are and will be talking tariff and sanctions relief with Iran. So that's a victory for Tehran. And he claims that many of the 15 points have already been agreed to. But so he's touching on what will be one of the thorniest issues in these upcoming talks. We don't know, though, if this is him wishing it or whether Tehran has signaled that they might be on board.
Richard, Iran's not going to agree to completely get rid of their Iranian enrichment, are they?
Highly unlikely. I can imagine what's the disposition of the uranium that's been enriched up to now, the 60%, the stockpile, whatever it is, in the rubble near Isfahan. What happens to that physically? Does that either get shipped out of the country, or is the intensity of the uranium enrichment reduced? Something that could happen. But this was the sticking point in the negotiations before the war. Right. This is when we demanded zero enrichment. The Iranians said no. In their 10-point plan, they again asked for the right to enrich. So the question is, would we accept a certain degree of enrichment at a low level with intrusive inspection? I would think this is going to be something that's going to be central to negotiations. Giving up their right to enrich highly, if that's our requirement, I think it's a long shot.
What do you think happens in 2 weeks with the relationship between Netanyahu and the United States government?
Look, Netanyahu needs to portray the relationship as excellent. He's facing an election this year, and he basically has the endorsement of Donald Trump. Donald Trump is very popular in Israel, at least was before this war. So my guess is the Israelis are going to try to make it look like there's no daylight whatsoever. I think there's going to be some questioning at this end. I think it's going to be a more problematic relationship here than it will be in Israel.
And the Trump repeatedly saying there's been regime change in Iran does not make it true. Of course, the theocracy there is still in place. General Hurley.